The glass should not have slumped. Saera had followed the recipe exactly as it appeared in the Vellsoreth archives. The proportions of silica and soda ash, the temperature curve, the precise moment to introduce the copper for color. The recipe was 900 years old. It had been transmitted across the void in the 17th year of the first crossing, encoded in the long stream of cultural data that built her people's world. Vellsoreth glass should hold its shape. It should cool to the milky translucence the old songs called moonskin, or breath of the third moon. Her grandmother had told her about it as a child, sitting in this same studio, on this same wooden stool, looking out at this same recreated harbor where the recreated ships came home each evening with their recreated cargo of recreated fish. But this morning Saera's glass had slumped. Not melted. Melted was what it was supposed to do, at the right temperature, with the right viscosity. It had drooped. It had failed to hold the shape. It had collapsed in the kiln like something giving up. She had made 3 attempts. All 3 failed. She sat in the dawn light, looking at the third lump of green-tinted glass, and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was looking at something that was hers. When she brought the slumped vessel to old Tael, he turned it in his hands for a long time before speaking.
You did the recipe.
Yes,
Exactly. And it slumped?
3 times, the same way each time.
Old Tael was master of the Glassmakers Guild, and he was also, Saera knew, the way everyone in the replica eventually knew, the last living person who'd been alive when the transmissions had stopped. Not the cultural transmissions. Those had ended 40 years before he was born, and were now a matter of historical record. The other transmissions, the personal ones, the voices from across the gap. He had been a young man when the antimatter civilization went silent. He had told her once, drunk on the festival wine that everyone in the replica drank because it was prescribed in the cultural archive but no one had ever liked, that he had been the one to receive the last message. Not him personally. He had been an apprentice at the communication station, 3rd shift, but he had been in the room. It had not been a goodbye. That, he said, was what was wrong with it. It had been a midweek shipping report, a list of crop yields. The kind of message they sent because they had been sending it for 9 generations and the rhythm was older than the urgency of any individual moment. Then nothing. For 2 years they had assumed atmospheric interference. For 5 years they had assumed equipment failure. After 10 years it was no longer something anyone talked about because the obvious truth was unbearable. The originals were gone. Dead, or moved beyond communication, or absorbed into something else. The replica was alone with its inheritance.
Slumping. I've seen this before.
You have?
3 times in my life. The last was 46 years ago.
He set it down carefully on the bench.
Each time the maker comes to me, each time they have followed the recipe exactly, and each time the glass refuses to cooperate.
What did the other makers do?
2 of them ground the slumped glass back to powder and tried again with different recipes from the archive. They eventually produced something acceptable.
And the third?
Old Tail looked at her with eyes the color of riverstone.
She kept the slumped vessel.
It was a week before Saera could bring herself to look at the vessel again. She had set it on the high shelf in her studio, behind the row of correctly shaped pieces from her apprenticeship. The goblets, the festival cups, the sacrament glasses, all in their precise traditional forms. The slumped piece sat in their shadow, ugly and accusing. It was beautiful. She did not want to think this, but it was. The way it had collapsed had been organic, almost intentional. The lip had folded inward into a soft curl. The base had spread like slow-cooling wax. The internal stresses had set into faint spiral lines that caught the morning light in ways that disciplined Vellsoreth forms never did. It looked like something a tide had made. Vellsoreth had no tides. The originals had lived on a tideless world. But this replica had tides. The engineers had not been able to recreate the antimatter physics exactly, and certain compromises had been made early on, and the moons were close enough that the sea climbed and fell every 9 hours. The first generation had grieved this. The third generation had stopped noticing. By Saera's generation, the tides were simply what the sea did. There were no songs about them. There were no rituals. There were no traditional forms shaped like the curve of a wave, because the originals had never seen a wave in their lives. The slumped vessel looked like a wave. She took it down from the shelf and set it on her workbench. She made another one the next morning. She used the same recipe, the same temperatures, but she let it stay in the kiln 7 minutes longer than the recipe called for because she wanted to see what would happen. This time the slump was deeper, more deliberate. The vessel sagged into a low oval bowl with a soft inward lip. When she filled it with water, the water sat there exactly as if the vessel had been designed to hold it. She made another the next day, and another. By the end of the week she had 6 slumped vessels on her bench, each one slightly different, each one made by varying small parameters of a recipe that was supposed to produce something else entirely. On the 7th day, her younger apprentice came to her and asked what she was making. Saera did not know what to say. There was no word in the Vellsoreth language for what she was making, because the Vellsoreth language had been complete when it was transmitted, and what she was making had not existed when the transmissions had been sent. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said,
I am making vessels.
For what use?
For holding water, for setting flowers in, for watching the light pass through them in the morning.
Her apprentice looked at the row of slumped pieces, at their soft folded lips, at the way they caught the dawn coming through the studio window. He was 14 years old. He had never wondered why the replica's sun was the wrong shade of gold, because no one had told him it was. He had never wondered why the wine tasted bad, because to him it tasted normal. He had been born into the world the second generation had built, and the world the second generation had built was, in ways no one could quite articulate, no longer Vellsoreth.
What are they called?
Saera thought about it. The honest answer was that they were not called anything. They had no name. The archive contained 11,000 words for vessels, categorized by use and form and ceremonial occasion, and none of them described the slumped pieces because the slumped pieces would never have been made in Vellsoreth proper. In Vellsoreth proper, they would have been considered failures and ground back to powder. In Vellsoreth proper, they would not have existed. But this was not Vellsoreth proper. This was the replica, and the replica was something else. The replica had tides. The replica had wines no one liked because no one had inherited the genetic preference for the original vintages. The replica had her, and she had hands that had been shaped by 900 years of glassmaking tradition, and she had made something the tradition would not have made.
They are called wave glasses.
The word came to her like something she had been carrying her whole life without knowing it. Her apprentice nodded as though this were obvious. He was 14. He had never heard the word before, and yet it was already familiar to him, because it was a word from his language, the language he was speaking and would speak to his children, and his children would not remember a time before there were wave glasses, and they would speak it without thinking about where it came from. This, Saera understood, was how it would happen. Not all at once. Not with declaration, just slowly, in pieces, beginning with one word for one shape that the inheritance had not contained, building up over generations into a vocabulary that described a world the originals had never seen. She would not live to see most of it. But she had named the wave glasses, and tomorrow she would make 7 more, and somewhere in the next century someone would write a poem about them, and the poem would be in their language, the language that was descended from Vellsoreth but was no longer Vellsoreth, the language of a people who had been told they were copies and had decided, slowly and without ceremony, to be themselves. She brought one of the wave glasses to old Tael that afternoon. He turned it in his hands the way he had turned the first one. The morning had ripened into noon. The light through his studio window was the wrong shade of gold, and it spilled across the slumped curve of the vessel and made it look like something taken out of water.
What is it called?
A wave glass.
He did not ask what a wave was. He had grown up in the replica. He knew what a wave was, even though the originals had never seen one.
They will be angry, the Preservation Council.
I know.
They will say you are diluting the tradition. They are not wrong, in a way. You are diluting it.
Yes.
Old Tile set the wave glass down on his bench. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up one of the correctly shaped Vellsoreth vessels from his own shelf and set it beside the wave glass. The two pieces sat together in the noon light. The Vellsoreth vessel was perfect, traditional, exactly the form the recipe specified. The wave glass was slumped and folded and held the light differently.
I think that the originals would have understood if they were still speaking to us. I think they would have said, yes, of course, this is what we hoped for. This was always the point of sending you. Not to be us forever, to be yourselves eventually.
Do you believe that?
I don't know what they would have said. They stopped speaking. But I have been alive a long time, and I have watched our people try very hard to remain who we were told to be, and I have watched it fail. And I have watched us refuse to admit it was failing. And I think we have been keeping a vigil for ghosts who never asked us to keep one.
He picked up the wave glass again. He turned it so the spiral cooling lines caught the light.
Make more of these. And when the council comes for you, send them to me.
That evening, Saera walked down to the harbor. The tide was going out. The recreated boats sat at their berths, their hulls revealed by the falling water, their keels showing the rust and barnacles that the engineers had built into them because the cultural archive had specified that boats should look this way, even though the original's boats had never had barnacles in the same form because the original seas had not been quite like this one. She watched the water draw away from the stones. She watched the small pools left in the dimples and crevices of the rocks. She watched the way the light from the wrong-colored sun caught the wet stone and made it shine. She thought, this is mine. She thought, I am not a continuation. I am a beginning. She thought, 900 years is a long time, and we have spent it being faithful. We can spend the next 900 being something else. The tide kept going out. The water kept finding its level. The light kept being the light it was, instead of the light it had been told to be. Somewhere behind her, in her studio, 6 wave glasses sat on a wooden bench and held the evening light, and they had no equivalent in the archive, and they were beautiful, and they were hers.